You can wear a badge and still be dead wrong. What would you do if the woman you loved was hurt in front of a crowd and no one stepped in? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that honor courage, justice, and our veteran heroes. The first time Paul Willis locked eyes with SWAT team commander Travis Myers, it wasn't in a courthouse, on the street, or even during war. It was in aisle 6 of a local hardware store. Myers had a firm grip on a DeWalt cordless drill and a superiority complex he wore like Kevlar. Paul, meanwhile, stood in worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots that still bore the red dust of Afghanistan buried in their soles. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just there to pick up a brass fitting for the new garden hose his wife Emily had insisted they needed before summer. But Travis had that kind of energy, the kind that looks for someone to step over. Paul wasn't that guy. "Didn't peg you for a hose and sprinkler kind of man," Travis said, stepping beside him with a smug tilt of his chin. Paul looked at him, not with threat, not with fear, but with that quiet kind of steadiness that unnerves men who live loud and need chaos to feel important. "Didn't peg you for someone who talks just to hear himself breathe," Paul replied. Travis laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still got that edge, huh?" he said, brushing past Paul's shoulder just a little too hard, like he was trying to check him in an invisible game. "Word is, you used to be somebody. Army, right?" Paul didn't answer. "You know," Travis went on, "people like you come back thinking you're owed something. You're not. You chose to sign up. Don't expect the rest of us to salute your problems." Paul set the fitting in his cart without a word. He could hear his pulse like a soft drumbeat in his ears, but not from fear, from restraint. That's what people never saw. They never saw how much it cost him to hold back. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, Paul hadn't seen Travis again, until the day Emily got tased. They weren't even supposed to be downtown that day. Emily had been working late at the high school, and Paul had been fixing the back porch screen when she texted him, "Can we go get gelato? I need to see something that's not fluorescent." He couldn't say no to that. Not to her. Not when she said it like that, with that tone that blended exhaustion and hope into one text bubble. They'd parked 2 blocks from the square, walked hand in hand past the cafe, the antique shop, the row of boutiques where Emily always paused to look at the display windows, like she was studying lives she didn't need to live but liked to imagine. Everything seemed normal. And then the shouting started. Paul turned instinctively, hand brushing toward his hip like muscle memory. But this wasn't Kabul. This was Springfield. And the noise wasn't gunfire. It was just angry voices, shouts, a few kids filming with their phones, something unfolding on the courthouse steps. Emily squeezed his hand and whispered, "Let's go around the back." But Paul had already seen the vests, the weapons, the black-clad figures moving with too much urgency for what looked like a man yelling about parking violations. A homeless vet named Curtis, if Paul remembered right. The guy talked to himself sometimes, but he was harmless. Everyone downtown knew that. Curtis was part of the rhythm of the city, muttering to pigeons and pulling his duffel bag like it contained the weight of every war he'd ever served in. So why were they treating him like a threat? Paul moved toward the steps. Emily tried to stop him. "Paul, not our fight." He looked at her. It might be. What happened next, no one expected. Certainly not Paul. Travis Myers was there, shouting orders like the whole city was under siege. And then someone pointed at Emily. She was recording, not shouting, not interfering, just standing near the edge of the gathering, filming the way the officers had surrounded Curtis. Travis turned. "Get her out of here." Paul didn't see who moved first. Maybe it was the officer with the overzealous grip on the taser. Maybe it was Travis, nodding once, barely, like giving a dog permission to bite. Either way, the crack of voltage in the air was unmistakable. Emily dropped. No scream. just the sharp snap of her body hitting the pavement, her phone skittering across the sidewalk. Paul saw red, the kind of red that used to come before every firefight, the kind of red that ended careers, marriages, lives. But he didn't charge, he didn't scream, he walked, straight through the shocked crowd, through the hesitation in their eyes, through the hesitation in the officers' eyes, too. He dropped to one knee beside Emily. Her eyes fluttered, lips parted in a whisper of pain. Paul's hands were already checking her pulse, her breathing. Automatic. Trained. Then he looked up, at Travis, at the squad, at all of them. The next words he said would stop them in their tracks. But that moment hasn't come yet. Because first he had to stand. And when Paul Willis stood, slow, deliberate, with every inch of his 6-foot frame uncoiling like a predator deciding whether to show its teeth, the entire sidewalk went quiet. Even the radios seemed to hush. Even Travis, whose mouth had been halfway open to justify the action, froze mid-breath. Paul's jaw clenched. Not from rage, from resolve. He looked at Travis the same way he used to look at IED triggers, coldly, calculating. And then, one hand still resting gently on Emily's shoulder, he said nothing. Not yet, because when the time came to speak, he knew what he'd say, but not until every SWAT officer in that square was looking at, and realizing he wasn't just a husband. He was a weapon they'd just provoked. The moment Paul stood upright, something shifted. Not just in the air, but in the posture of the men around him. Some of them were still gripping their rifles a little too tight, fingers twitching near triggers not meant for this kind of situation. They were trained for escalation. Paul had been trained for restraint. He scanned their faces, not with fear, not even with anger, but with that same expression he used to wear behind the turret of a Humvee, scanning ridgelines for movement. Calculated, unreadable, unflinching. Emily was groaning softly now, her legs spasming involuntarily from the residual voltage still crackling through her system. Paul didn't look down. Not yet. His job right now wasn't just to protect her body. It was to restore what had just been shattered. Control. "Step away from the woman," one of the younger officers barked. He couldn't have been older than 25, maybe newly transferred in. Paul glanced at his badge. Ramirez. His stance was wide, textbook tactical, but his eyes were unsure. Paul didn't move. "I said step away." Still, Paul stood there. No threat in his movement. No sudden gestures. Just presence. That alone was louder than any outburst. Then Travis Myers stepped forward. "You're obstructing an investigation," he called out, voice low and deadly serious. "You need to back away, or I'll—" "You what?" Paul's voice cut through the tension like a suppressed rifle shot in the desert. Flat, lethal, final. There was something different about the way he said it. Not challenging, not mocking. It was a question that weighed more than it should have. It hung in the air, turning every officer's head toward their commanding officer, waiting to see how he would answer. Travis blinked. She was interfering with law enforcement. She refused to comply with a lawful order. She was filming. That's not... She was filming, Travis. Paul stepped forward now. Just one step, but it was like an earthquake moved underfoot. "You saw that, and you authorized the strike?" Emily coughed behind him, still trying to sit up. Her breath was shallow, skin pale. Paul squatted beside her again. His fingers gently brushed the side of her neck, checking her pulse. She winced. "Right, I got you," he murmured. "I got you." "Em—" She tried to speak, but her jaw clenched, words trapped beneath the pain. Behind them, the murmuring of the crowd began again. Phones were out, recording, broadcasting. Hashtags were already being imagined. The people saw it all now. Black boots surrounding a woman on the ground and her husband, upright like an anchor, refusing to kneel. Call the paramedics, Paul said, eyes still on Emily. Ramirez hesitated. He needs medical attention. Or do we need to have that discussion in front of the internet? Ramirez nodded to another officer who finally reached for the radio. Travis stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. You're turning this into something it's not, Paul. Paul stood again. I didn't turn anything. You did that the moment you thought power was a license to humiliate. The older man's nostrils flared. She was warned. She was calm. She was part of a crowd ignoring police instructions. She was standing still. Travis's face reddened. You don't get to... Paul stepped closer. I don't get to what? Speak the truth? Or remind you I've seen what happens when leadership turns into arrogance? That landed hard. Because Paul wasn't just a man with combat experience. He was known, respected. Everyone in that square, if they didn't know his name, they knew someone who did. He wasn't just some veteran. He was the guy who'd carried 2 wounded out under fire and refused his Bronze Star because he said dead men deserved it more. Paul turned now, slowly, scanning the remaining SWAT members. You all trained for active shooters, for hostage takedowns, for domestic terror, not for tasering women who hold cell phones. Silence. A drone hovered overhead. Someone in the crowd had launched it. An eye in the sky, capturing everything. Paul knelt beside Emily again, his voice quieter now. Stay with me, okay? She nodded faintly, lips trembling. You... good? I'm fine. His fingers brushed her hair from her eyes. You'll be okay. Just breathe. The paramedics arrived then, weaving through the onlookers who'd gathered like witnesses around a courtroom gallery. One of them, a woman in her 40s with salt in her dark hair, recognized Paul immediately. Her mouth parted, but she said nothing. She just moved faster. They gently began to check Emily's vitals, placing a mask over her mouth, wrapping blood pressure cuffs. Paul stepped back only when the medic touched his arm and gave a slight nod, not a permission slip, just a gesture of mutual understanding. As he turned, Paul met Travis's gaze again. You ever wonder why the guys you lead follow orders but never follow you? Travis stiffened. It's because you mistake silence for respect, fear for authority. Paul took a breath. Real command isn't about force. It's about responsibility. You forgot that. Travis said nothing. Paul didn't expect him to. He was the kind of man who'd never admit he'd gone too far. At least not until his name was dragged across morning news chyrons and late-night commentary. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Emily was stable, conscious, but still hurting. Paul looked around at the people still filming. Keep recording, he said. Don't stop. Don't let anyone bury this. He turned to walk toward the ambulance, but not before glancing back one last time. 5 words, Travis, he said, voice just loud enough to carry. The commander raised a brow. Paul held his gaze. You just messed with the wrong... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone there filled in the blank. Every officer, every civilian, every person with a phone in their hand and a heart beating in their chest. Paul climbed into the back of the ambulance, took Emily's hand in his, and didn't look back as the doors closed behind him. The ambulance's interior smelled like antiseptic and old vinyl, the kind that seeped into your lungs and stayed there like a memory you couldn't shake. Emily's breathing had steadied, but her eyes remained closed, her brow occasionally twitching with discomfort beneath the oxygen mask. Paul sat beside her, one hand clutching the rail of the gurney, the other resting on her forearm, his thumb brushing slow, steady circles into her skin. His mind wasn't in the ambulance, and who was already racing ahead to what came next. The second they'd pulled away from the courthouse steps, Paul knew the story wouldn't stay quiet, not in a town like Springfield, not with a crowd that big, not with cell phone footage already bubbling into social media. tethered to hashtags like Justice for Emily and Tased for Truth. But it wasn't the press that Paul was thinking about. It was the silence, the kind that crept in after something unjust had happened, and everyone waited to see who would speak first. Paul didn't plan to wait. The ambulance reached County General in under 7 minutes. Inside the ER bay, nurses descended like a practiced storm, wheels locking, gloves snapping, voices exchanging terms Paul had heard in combat zones, but now wore civilian accents. He stepped back just enough to give them room, but stayed close enough to remind everyone she wasn't alone. A young nurse, a brunette with clipped speech and precise hands, turned to him. "She'll need imaging and observation, but she's stable. You can wait down the hall or—" "Not leaving her." The nurse gave him a look, started to say something, then caught herself. Maybe it was the steel in his voice. Maybe it was the faded unit tattoo half visible beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his flannel. Either way, she nodded. "Okay, just let us do our part." He stepped back as far as they needed, but not a step more. Emily's eyes opened again briefly. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. Paul leaned down, close enough for her to hear without needing to ask. "You're okay," he whispered. "They can't touch you now." The look she gave him was faint, but unmistakable. Trust, pain, and something heavier beneath it. Shame. It hit him in the gut, not because of what happened, but because she felt it. Outside the hospital, the real war had already begun. The footage spread like wildfire, picked up by every local news outlet and then picked apart in national comment sections. One clip showed Emily standing silently. Another captured the moment her body convulsed under the voltage. But it was the image of Paul, rising slowly, eyes locked on the SWAT officers, unmoving like a monolith, that turned him into a symbol before he could stop it. He hadn't planned on being anyone's cause, but the moment had chosen him. By nightfall, Paul was sitting in the hospital's empty family lounge, the soda machine humming beside him as he scrolled through messages on his phone. He hadn't posted anything yet, but the calls were coming in. From veterans he hadn't seen in years, from local leaders, from lawyers, from a podcast host he didn't even recognize who promised just 10 minutes of your voice could change the national conversation. He didn't want to change the conversation. He wanted accountability, and that was something you didn't earn by going viral. You earned it by going forward. He pulled up his contacts and found a name he hadn't dialed in over a decade: Colonel William Stroud. The man picked up on the third ring. "Willis?" "Sir." "It's been a long time." "That it has." The voice was gravel and oak. "I saw the footage." Of course he had. Stroud probably had a dozen senators and judges on speed dial. "I need help," Paul said. No hesitation, no pride, just purpose. Stroud was silent for a moment, then asked, "Legal or tactical?" "Both." Another pause, then a chuckle. "You always did know how to start a war in 5 words or less." "This isn't war," Paul said. "It's exposure. Same thing these days." Stroud gave him a name, then another, then a third, an attorney who specialized in public misconduct and a non-profit that provided media shielding for whistleblowers and wrongfully accused citizens. By the time the call ended, Paul had 2 appointments lined up and an email full of case files to read. But more than that, he had momentum. By the following morning, Paul had been asked to speak at a town hall. Not officially, of course. The city council hadn't invited him, but the people had. He almost said no. But when he returned to Emily's hospital room and found her sitting upright, bruised but conscious, watching the news with that same grim determination she used to show when grading stacks of essays at the kitchen table, he knew he couldn't turn away. "They're lying," she whispered hoarsely, gesturing at the television. "No. They said I reached for a weapon." "They saw?" Her eyes welled, but not from fear. "Paul, if you say something, they'll come for you." I'm not worried about me." She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Then worry about us, because they won't just discredit you, they'll destroy you." He met her gaze, then kissed the top of her hand. Let them try. The town hall was packed. People stood against walls, shoulder to shoulder, some still in work uniforms, others dressed like they were heading to church. The mayor wasn't there. Neither was Travis Myers, but his shadow was. Paul walked in through the side entrance, no fanfare, no entourage. Just a man with a story and a truth too heavy to keep inside any longer. He stepped up to the podium. He didn't clear his throat, didn't adjust the mic. He just looked at the crowd, really looked, and said, "I didn't come here to talk about politics. I came to talk about power." Every head lifted. The room went silent.